It's pretty clear that whoever is the next president is going to have to deal with some sort of U.S. government debt crisis. And I'm concerned about how that response is going to be regardless of which candidate wins. So, for example, Trump, in his case, when there was a major economic crisis, what happened economically as a result of lockdown policy and because of COVID-19, the person that he and his administration reached out to was Larry Fink of Blackrock, who implemented something we can get into later that some researchers have called the going direct reset, which was basically a way to put money from QE directly in the hands of the private sector instead of public entities, sort of like it had been done before. And arguably that resulted in a massive wealth transfer, and BlackRock didn't really use that money to help Main Street at all. They used it to buy shares in their own ETFs, among other things. Kamala, in her case, her entire economic team is essentially led by former BlackRock executives. And that was also true for the Biden administration. So essentially BlackRock, which was also played a major role in sort of developing the bailouts in the 2008 economic crisis, which was under Obama, right, will likely be developing the response for whatever this, coming economic crisis is, regardless of who gets in office. If we look at, the policy actions of the people running who they turn to in a time of crisis or who is running their economic team, that seems increasingly likely. So that is why I'm very concerned, I guess I would say, about BlackRock in particular, because they seem to be the people that the government turns to regardless of whether a Democrat or Republican is in office. And, they have sort of a history of really affecting wealth transfers during these crises at a time when, they're supposedly developing or helping develop policy meant to bail out Main Street. They end up sort of affecting massive bailouts for Wall Streets and, of course, the people that BlackRock are trying to generate profits for ultimately. And the other thing that I'm really concerned about as it relates to, a coming economic crisis is that I think we're going to see a major effort to saddle American consumers with programmable, surveillable money and seizable money. And so, of course, a lot of people for years now have been very concerned about central bank digital currencies or CBDCs. But there are also things issued by the private sector, like stable coins, for example, that are just as programmable and surveillable and seizable as CBDCs are. So I think it's very likely in the event of a major debt crisis or some sort of crisis that damages significantly regular Americans' purchasing power, there will be an effort to onboard Americans onto one of those two versions of programmable, surveillable money. So it's possible, if Kamala wins, we could see a CBDC or something like that. But in the case of Trump, he's sort of come out in favor of stable coins. He did that recently at his speech at the Bitcoin conference earlier this year. And, stable coins are just as programmable and surveillable and seizable as CBDCs in theory are. And I think those, as people have rightly pointed out, are a threat to our financial privacy and ultimately our financial freedom. So I think people should be focusing not just on CBDCs, but also, these other digital currencies that have the potential to offer those same, Orwellian functionalities to the people, issuing them and producing them. And some of those prominent stablecoins like Circle, for example, have major alliances with BlackRock, and BlackRock has a minority stake in them and have, said in some of their SEC filings that, the stablecoins can be used to manipulate the price of Bitcoin, for example. I think there's things that we can look at as far as BlackRock is concerned that sort of give us clues as to what their agenda may be. And the most concerning thing to me about that, as it relates to people like Larry Fink, is that Larry Fink is on record saying things like markets don't really like democracies because they're messy. Markets like totalitarian governments. And Larry Fink is someone who's been very obsessed with risk management most of his career and sees essentially, free democracies and arguably also a free market in some senses, as generating more risk than perhaps he would like to handle. So when you're able to sort of control and centralize both markets and governments, you're able to control the amount of risk that's there. And so maybe that's good for asset managers like Larry Fink who are obsessed with this kind of stuff. But for, regular people, ultimately it reduces the amount of freedom that we would have. So I sort of see Larry Fink as someone who's looking to centralize power and centralize wealth. And obviously that has major impacts on, regular Americans and the people that aren't necessarily in the oligarch class or in the top 1% that would benefit from those types of policies. But in terms of looking at what BlackRock has done in terms of U.S. fiscal policy, I think it's important to sort of look at their role in, the '08 crisis, which began the policy of quantitative easing, and later on they were called upon by the Trump administration to help develop COVID fiscal response. But actually it began before then. So in the fall of 2019 at Jackson Hole, and this is also, should point out, this is based on the very excellent research of John Titus of the YouTube channel Best Evidence. Essentially, this document was presented by BlackRock to central bankers at Jackson Hole. It was called Going Direct, is what they called it. And basically the idea was to have, what was generated via quantitative easing, not just go to public sector affiliated entities, but also directly into the hands of the private sector, i.e. Wall Street. And that was essentially what was proposed. And this begins to be implemented well before COVID, when the repo market goes a bit haywire at the end of 2019 and sort of continues through up until COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, at which point, there's a lot of calls between Larry Fink and Steve Mnuchin and other top figures and the economic team of the Trump administration. And then they begin to basically affect this policy or sort of really supercharge this policy and go direct even more. So there's a lot of, things that are happening in terms of economic policy that ultimately resulted in what we're dealing with now, I guess, debasement of U.S. American consumer purchasing power. But a lot of this money at a time when there were lockdowns and there was really very little economic activity going on, they're being given all of this, people like BlackRock asset managers are being given all of this money. And instead of helping out Main Street, they go up and buy up all the assets. They buy shares in their own ETFs, for example. And basically what happened during COVID was a massive wealth transfer. And if you look at the statistics of it, the top 1% in the United States benefited hugely during COVID, but the rest of us did not. Maybe some people got stimulus in that, but a lot of the consequences downstream of those policies have resulted in this, inflationary situation we're in and a lot of other, economic issues that people are dealing with. And so BlackRock sort of, I would argue, oversaw these wealth transfers sort of, to the benefit of Wall Street and not Main Street. And it seems like, if there is another crisis coming down the pike, which it seems there is, BlackRock is likely to do essentially the same thing. At times when that fiscal policy is meant to help regular Americans, it has not been doing that when BlackRock is involved. And really, this is something that most Americans don't even know happened. To describe the exact mechanism, again, I would refer you to John Titus or his work, his article on Going Direct on the Solari report, which you can view for free. It's very well documented and describes all of that in detail. I'm just sort of pointing out his research because I think it's very important as it relates to BlackRock and what their impact on COVID fiscal policy response is. But again, for those very in-depth explanations of what the mechanisms are and how Going Direct has happened, I would definitely encourage you to either have him on or read his work because it's forensic, very detailed, and he makes just a completely airtight case for what happened as it relates to BlackRock and Going Direct and COVID fiscal response. In BlackRock's case, there was a funding facility set up. There were several set up during COVID, but there were a couple of them, I think 2, that were essentially given to BlackRock to manage. And again, this is a policy that BlackRock wrote well before COVID about what the Fed should do during the next downturn. And then the Fed implements that plan exactly well before COVID-19. And then when COVID-19 happens, they sort of supercharge the policy and then develop these funding facilities allegedly for bailing out Main Street as a result of lockdown policy. And then BlackRock is directly managing a lot of those funds. I think now it's perhaps different than in times past where you have, in the case of Trump, Larry Fink used to be, Trump's personal money manager. And, Trump is on record saying that Larry Fink made him a very large amount of money as a result of that partnership. And then in the case of Biden and Kamala, you have, basically their economic policy, Bidenomics or what will become Kamalanomics or whatever, essentially being designed by former BlackRock executives as well. So, if this is what they did during COVID and we can look at, the other things that BlackRock has done as it relates to U.S. fiscal policy in the past, it seems like that's what we can expect, regardless of who wins in November, if the next 4 years brings us some sort of economic crisis, which it seems like there will be some sort of economic event. You have people like the former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, saying that it's very likely the next president is going to deal with the U.S. government debt crisis, for example. So, this isn't something I'm just speculating on. There's major politicians that say we should very much much expect some sort of economic crisis to come on the scene over the next, 4 to 5 years. And with, either with Trump having a policy record of putting BlackRock at the helm when there is a economic crisis, and then Kamala and Biden, having BlackRock run their economic policy, either way, this is an entity that we should be looking at and scrutinizing, because it's very likely they will be developing the fiscal response once again to whatever that crisis is. I think when a crisis is happening, people tend to have emotional responses and tend to be coming from a place of fear. And that tends to prevent people from thinking critically or calmly or rationally about situations or about policies. During COVID, obviously, a lot of focus was on COVID-19 itself, on the biosecurity situation, not just so much on the financial situation. But for example, if there was a major crisis going forward that would greatly impact Americans' ability to engage in economic activity, or have their purchasing power, close to wiped out or something, I think you would see a lot of people really beg for any policy response. Solve this crisis now, we need something, and not really have people think about what is the best policy response to this kind of crisis. People aren't going to think calmly and bring everything to the table, and it's very unlikely there will be some sort of calm, open, public debate about it. Generally what happens is that the government says people are scared and emotional, they clamor for some sort of solution from the government, and the government offers some sort of solution. And, like with COVID-19, BlackRock anticipated the next downturn about a month before the repo market started going haywire, and presented to central bankers, this is the policy you should implement during the next downturn. And it's very possible that BlackRock is working on policy papers for central bankers or other people in, the US government about what policy should be implemented if, this type of crisis happens or that type of crisis happens. It seems like they seem to be designing the policies, I guess. And they've, had, in the Biden administration over the past 4 years, former BlackRock executives have been leading his economic team, bringing us to where we are now, and likely influencing what will happen over the next couple of years whenever or up until this crisis emerges. So it seems, very likely that they'll be, dominating fiscal response again. And then people, because they're not really aware of how this is developed, or really, there's just not a lot of media coverage about, for example, the role of BlackRock in the Biden administration, or, on Kamala's economic team specifically. I've seen very little coverage, if any, of that recently. Maybe a few blips here and there of when those people are appointed, but nothing significant beyond that. And then, of course, there was very little scrutiny of U.S. COVID fiscal response, I think, as well. I mean, it's just sort of written off as this is what the government had to do to respond to the crisis in a lot of situations. But I don't think that's necessarily true, because, again, that fiscal response began well before, COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, preceding that by several months. I think it's a complicated situation. It's complicated to anticipate what will exactly happen. But again, history tends to repeat itself in these cases. And the fact that you have BlackRock so embedded with the Democrats specifically, and also have this historical precedent with Trump when he was in office last time, it seems very likely that they'll be doing this again. So I guess my role in this is to try and generate awareness so we can have a discussion before that time of crisis, when people are emotional and afraid and concerned about their money, about whether we should be having BlackRock at the helm of this when the next crisis emerges. I would say no. I think our current system, specifically as it relates to, the U.S. Treasury Department, has consistently been a revolving door for the last several decades with Wall Street. Former Goldman Sachs executives have held very prominent roles at the Treasury when crises have emerged. So as an example, you have one of the top guys at Goldman Sachs, Robert Rubin, being a key figure in the Clinton administration's economic policy as Treasury Secretary, and helping engineer the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which creates, arguably the 2008 financial crisis, when George W. Bush's Secretary Treasury at the time the crisis happens is Henry Paulson, another former top guy from Goldman Sachs, that allegedly told members of Congress if they didn't bail out the banks that martial law may be declared in the United States, for example. And then when the COVID fiscal response happened, Steve Mnuchin is a former top Goldman Sachs executive as well. As far as, the big parties, Democrat and Republican, they tend to appoint people to Treasury that come from these top Wall Street banks that have a history of predatory and arguably criminal behavior. And so, I think there needs to be a much larger structural change, I guess, to prevent that type of revolving door policy if we're going to see any sort of meaningful fiscal response to a crisis that actually does take, the needs of regular Americans into account. because historically that is not what has happened. And the people that come to Treasury tend to have the best interest of Wall Street at heart and not the best interest of regular Americans at heart. And I think, again, that's sort of a phenomenon that's not exclusive to Treasury either. You have this type of revolving door phenomenon in really most aspects, if not all, of the US government, where you sort of have regulatory capture of the people supposedly regulating those industries. The industries themselves tend to have put their top people, at least these days, into those major regulatory positions through this revolving door phenomena. So I think we need to find a meaningful way to stop that before we can expect that, major government fiscal response would be designed with the interest of regular Americans of heart, with Main Street at heart and not Wall Street at heart.